Hello and welcome to Community Topics number 34 of Dualistic Unity. I am not what you think I am. Dualistic Unity is not what you think it is. Whatever the fuck you think Dualistic Unity is not what it is. Whatever you think we're trying to accomplish here, whatever you think we're trying to create or become or show the world, isn't it? Because we're it. You're it. You're already doing it in each and every moment. We're just having a conversation as an expression of that, but it's nowhere to get, nothing to prove because there's no one else besides me. So if anything, that's driving me is just, why not?
And I have nothing to say. I just want to get down to brass tacks and start talking about this goddamn topic because it's important. And not only is it important, it's been one of the most important conversations I have had with myself over the last 20 years of my life that we haven't really had a chance to get into yet. And I want to warn the listener right now, likely this conversation is going to be uncomfortable because it's going to be brutally honest. Today's community topic is about the Messiah complex or the God complex. And it's so important to recognize that while we often talk about the weight of the ego and how it can drag you down into being selfish and self-absorbed, it can make you competitive, it can make you manipulative, it can do all of that fun stuff, it can make you an asshole. The other end of that is thinking you're the Messiah, thinking that you're the one who's here to save everyone else because you know the answers. That is just as much the ego. And it is an unfortunate byproduct of the spiritual path. So I'm glad we're getting into this one today.
Likewise, it's going to be a fun one, and I don't really know where to start. I guess just because it's top of mind, and this is being released as we're at the retreat, which is we're having a grand old time there, but it was recorded a little while ago. And there's been discussions about what we're trying to do here. What's important to keep in mind as you're interacting with more and more people who tell you how things are, even when they do have caveats. There's a sensitivity where you recognize that where they're coming from is a lot of times rooted in an idea they have of themselves. And that's always going to distort the message, no matter how good the message sounds. If it's coming from a place in which they're seeing themselves in a certain way, I don't know, there's something about it to be careful of. And I think a large aspect of this is the clinging to certain people as being more enlightened, more spiritual, closer to God in a certain way, because we do everything we possibly can to push back against that fucking bullshit, because that doesn't do good for anyone. The only thing that allows to feel better is your narrative, your idea of you. And so why do people cling to people who have a certain Messiah complex or God complex, which, we'll get into more detail as to what that is, but why do people do it? Because they want to be it. Because they want to be that person. They're striving to be that thing. That's why they laud those types of people. That's why they get super fucking triggered when you say, "Hey, I think they're kind of full of shit." Whoever it is, whatever person, if you have a visceral internal reaction to that being said about someone that you follow, or when someone comes around and questions what their intentions may be, if you get super defensive about that, there's a depth there that I think is important to look at. There's a response there that's important to wonder about why you're clinging so tightly to this person's message. Do you think that they are in a certain place that you want to be at? Because as soon as you think that You want to be somewhere else. You want to be in a certain spot. You want to get to a certain level of fucking enlightenment and that whole bullshit narrative, or you want to get a higher spiritual intelligence score or anything like that. It's taking you further from reality. It's taking you further from what actually allows you to get better, because measuring yourself, comparing yourself, trying to get to a certain place doesn't help anything but your idea of yourself, but your ego. Why measure anything if not to make your ego feel a little bit better?
But it feels so good to feel like a savior. It feels so good to be surrounded by those that you perceive as needing to be saved. And that is ultimately the temptation. It's where altruism suddenly takes a hard right and ends up becoming self-serving. It's because you're still doing it for the sake of you. Whether you want to see it that way or not, you could say, well, it's a good intentions, right? But you're still perceiving everybody as somehow needing you, specifically you, because it's still about you. And so I think a big part of this comes down to the perception of a spiritual path, the perception of a start point and an end point, that at some point in the future, we're going to get to enlightenment or God, or whatever it is you'd like to call it. And so if that's the case, then there are people who are farther up that path and people who are farther back that path. And the people who are farther up that path need to help the poor bastards at the back of that path, don't you know? And so the ego just loves that shit. You can hear it, eh? You can just hear it right there. You're just like, oh yeah, we got to help the poor masses. But the fact is that every one of those people is the very same moment that you are. And in that moment, they can find any perception of themselves, regardless of their environment. Now, we often talk about the path to freedom, but that path is now. It's not actually a path. This is why Andrew has discussed it before as kind of the floor dropping out from underneath you, because all of a sudden you just slip into what you've always been. And there is no tool, there is no practice, there is no philosophy, there is no religion, there is no path that is required to get you there, because you're always there. And that is conveniently forgotten by your average savior who is looking at their own importance more than anything else.
With that path, we very much put the cart before the horse with that idea. Like the path is almost something that plays out the more deeply you recognize that there isn't one. It's like as that begins to happen, you can kind of look at the narrative, at the story, at whatever, and be like, oh, there was sort of a path there. I can look back at, my experiences and be like, oh yeah, it was that. But we've absolutely fucked that and think that there is a path that is in front of us. There is no path in front of you. It's almost as if you're making the path as you go through recognizing more and more clearly that there's no fucking path. And then we can look at it and be like, oh yeah, there are these things, these things, these things. But now we have all these spiritual motherfuckers being like, okay, here's the scale. Here's the path. Here's, if you're doing these things, then like you're not quite doing it. And there's, you got to get to the next step. And we're like, oh yeah, okay, where am I on this path? It's like there's no fucking path. There is no path. There is no path whatsoever. There is the perception of a path that could be something that you cling to, early on in said path that unfolds as you look back upon your experiences, as you're looking back at it. But as long as you think that there's something in front of you, that there's some sort of path that you are a part of right now, it's going to fuck it all up. There is no path. And sure, you can be like, oh, well, you guys are just far down the path. And so you're not looking back at no one got farther, quote unquote, farther down the path through believing there is a path. Thinking there's a path is getting stuck in the perception of you, in the perception of you being on a path. Boom, division right there. Well, you're just, you've gotten past that. There's lots of things that you went through that got you to recognize that there is no path. It's like, sure, looking back at it, but I'm not gonna say like, yeah, there's a path. That path distorts it. That idea of there even being a path distorts it. And so people have taken that recognition of the journey someone takes through their life and place it in front of us as if now it's like this curated thing that we can take steps along. We can measure our progress along the way. Measuring your progress is the most egotistical fucking thing you can ever do. Whose progress is being measured? All of reality's or yours? Your ego's, and how it measures up relative to all the other egos out there. How well you're doing. Oh, I made progress today. I jumped levels, got to a new level. Oh, I feel better about myself. You're bringing your idea of yourself along with you. You're getting further from it each and every time you do that. And so I think it's very, long story short, that path is not something that actually exists. It's a way that we look back at things and construct things and make sense of maybe a journey that we took, but it is in no way in front of you. There is no path.
Well said, because it's not about valuing the path or the tools so much as the only one who can do anything with any of that, which is you, here and now. And you can recognize where you might be a little caught up in the path. And this is something that often comes up, that we will look at the tools that got us to where we are, and then we will convince ourselves that they are necessary to everybody else's journey. These tools must be used. They helped me. They will help everyone, because everyone is exactly like me. And I find that funny. And I want to point out again, the reason I'm excited to have this conversation is because anyone who starts to get any of this on any level whatsoever, about all of this being one, about your nature being far more than just a bag of meat moving around a rock, you immediately start to feel like, oh, wow, I'm finally getting it. I'm of higher consciousness. And immediately you start to feel a higher value because of how much you are now able to see. And that is natural. It's a natural part of the journey, but it is the next danger in that journey, the spiritual ego, quote unquote, because it's still focused on you. It's still focused on you. So in my experience, I have had to watch for that vigilantly over the years, especially dealing with people in various different mentalities. People who were very religious, people who were very spiritual, people who were atheists, people who were heavily invested in the egotistical mentality that drives our market, that kind of thing. In all of those conversations, the temptation has always been, why can't you just see things my way? And that always reinforces me, the idea of me. I'm still identifying with this character, not the all and everything of my existence, of reality. And so it's reinforcing that limitation. But it's hard to keep that in mind over time. And I'm happy with the progress that I've made in that regard, simply because of this. There was a period in my life where I had convinced myself you had to go through trauma to have this awakening, for it to stick and mean anything to you. Over years and years, I kept questioning that, because that's kind of depressing. And out of all of the possible characters that could exist, there has to be characters that don't have to go as deep into the darkness. And so I recognized it was just me again, holding on to my character and its path and so on and so forth. And I worked at that and I worked at that until finally I met Andrew. And Andrew comes from a completely different type of narrative as me. And I'm happy to say I was right. You don't have to go through the same trauma. You don't have to do things as I did. You don't have to do things as anybody has. You can do things as you are doing them now. because it's always the same moment that you can take advantage of. It's always the same you that's able to take advantage of it. It doesn't matter what you're doing. It doesn't matter what you're doing. I want to say that very clearly. It does not matter if you're in the military. It doesn't matter if you play video games all day. It doesn't matter if you're in the porn industry. It doesn't matter. You have the same potential as anyone else. There is no Messiah. There is no one except you. And that's all of us. So there's no importance in that. There's no levels. There's no scale. There's nowhere to go. We are already each other.
And I think that's a big aspect of a lot of the people that you see in spirituality. They that very much have that complex, and people see it in that way. Is it always comes with this strange sort of prerequisites. Like there's a way that you act when you're enlightened. There's a way that you speak when you're enlightened. There are things you do and there are things that you don't do when you're enlightened. You kind of have this aura about you when you're enlightened. Fuck all that. Fuck all that bullshit. Oh my God. It's like that's not freedom. If you think there are prerequisites to freedom, it's not freedom. Anything you think, oh, hey, I think you should tone down that. Oh, I think you should, you can't do that work because it's not high conscious living. Like, fuck all that. It's all made up bullshit. It all takes you further from the recognition that you're it. You are it. You are it. You are it. There's no other. There's no comparison. There is nowhere to get. There is nothing to base any value off of that isn't you. And I think that's a big aspect of this is like we get caught up in the illusion that our value ever fluctuates in any way, shape, or form. And so we think that, I'm this, I now see myself in this way. My value has now gone up. I move up the scale. I move down the path. I'm deeper in the past. My value is now higher. When I'm not quite there. That person's further down. Their value is higher than me. And it's all an illusion. That idea that your value ever shifts or changes or that it could ever possibly go up is a complete illusion. No matter what you do, no matter what you're doing, as Ray said, literally any job could be, you'd be in the porn industry. Your value does not waver. There is nothing less valuable about doing that. It's you, being you, interacting with you, on you, as you, in you. It's all like there's no, oh my God, like there's no prerequisites to any of this. There is no right way to act. There is no fucking rule book whatsoever. If you think there is any rule book whatsoever, and you kind of have that idea that there's anywhere to get, that there's a depth, that there's a place outside of where you're at here now, what you're doing, that is a better place to be, that will add more value to you, that could possibly lower your value. It's not it. But that's what so many people who get caught up in this narrative of seeing themselves in a certain way are thinking. And so they feel like they have to act in a certain way. People are seeing them in a certain way. And I think this is a part I wanted to go through too, is like, as you push back more and more, as you deepen into the recognition that there's nowhere to get, people do start to see you in a certain way. They'll start seeing you as, more fucking like enlightened or some shit like that. And I know, because like we'll get comments and we'll get people saying like, oh, it's so amazing to see someone, at your age recognizing these things. And like with all of that, there's the reason that people do that is to justify where they're at and to justify their desire to get to the place that they think that you're at. and that keeps them from getting there. So a big, I very often, as I can, push back against that because there's nothing about me that is any different than anything that anyone else in all of reality has access to ever, here now, at all. But people like to see people in a certain way because it justifies their perception that they're not there yet. And so if you're in that spot where people are, looking at you in a certain way and you're not pushing back against it, you're not doing anyone any good. If you're like, yeah, you know what? I am pretty clear. I am getting this stuff pretty well. I am. Yeah, maybe I am. My value is pretty damn high. I really like this idea of myself, feeling pretty damn good about it. It doesn't help anyone but your fucking ego. And it creates this sort of hierarchy, this division between you and anyone else that makes them feel like they aren't there right now and that they want to get to where you're at. And it's not that at all. We're all the same moment. You're the same moment here now. And everyone has the capacity, no matter where they're at or how they think, to let go of that narrative, of that idea of themselves in any way, shape, or form. But those who start getting seen in a certain way attach to that idea of themselves. And that does way more harm than it does good because it's not helping the reality of you at all. It's only ever helping the idea feel a little bit better.
And it's so interesting because you can see the difference between the God complex and the God reality in terms of how much control you need to be in. It comes down to your perspective of power and division and all of that fun stuff, because the God reality is actually quite humble in that it has faith in itself, in all of its other iterations and incarnations. It doesn't need to be in control. It is everything. So there's nothing to have a complex about because there's no you. You, the idea, has ceased to be something that you can attach to. But it's the idea of you that will linger as long as it can. And it will do so under the guise of having good intentions. It will do so with the justification. Right. But, we're just entertaining the ego in other people to help them along the path. If you want to help people along the path, let go of yours and let go of the perception that they're on one. Because you're both here now. And in that, there is an opportunity to connect as reality, which means to just have a fucking conversation. It doesn't mean teach me about the goddamn chakras. It doesn't mean that I need you to pull out your crystal bowl. It doesn't mean that I need you to do a mantra or any of that shit. The incense is unnecessary unless you want to spark up a joint. There is nothing you need to teach me, and there's nothing I need to teach you. The truth is what is. The truth is here. It's all of this running around. It's all of this needing to get somewhere for the sake of feeling a certain way about ourselves. Either I'm not going to get there, I'm too far away, I'm getting there, oh, I'm getting closer, oh, I'm farther along the path than other people. It's all just me. And it stops you from being what you really are. And as long as you are not what you really are, other people aren't what they really are to you. And so you'll need to save them.
Yeah, and it's all really tied in to each other. Your perception of yourself, your perception of other people, how you value yourself, how you value your relationship to other people. But as long as you have, and I know there's pushback to this every time we say it because it's like, oh, you're discounting, where people are at. But if you have a perception that you're anywhere that isn't where you should be, an idea of, oh, I'm improving, oh, I'm falling back, oh, I took a few steps back this week, and you're like, oh, I got to get back into it. I gotta, and you're perceiving any relative nature to you being somewhere that you shouldn't be, or be along a fucking journey and like progressing more quickly, or not progressing as quickly, taking you further from it, because there is no regression. There's a depth to here now, but there is no progression outside of here now. And so it's not about getting anywhere. It's not about thinking that there's somewhere else that you should be. Because all of that, all of those narratives, all of those ideas that anyone is pushing, anyone who says, oh, maybe I am, superior in any way, shape, or form, is immediately creating a narrative, creating a division, and causing people to think that they're not where they should be. You're always where you're at, which is what you are, which is what I am. There's no division between any of those things. So, if anything, it's just realizing that, and even not realizing it is still it. There's a different sort of conversation that begins to happen when you recognize that there is no place you should be other than where you're at. And until then, you're always going to think there is somewhere else. And as you see people in certain ways, you're going to think that you should be where they're at. But it's all you anyway. So there's nowhere else you should ever be.
And I'd like to address the obvious question that's going to come up as a result of you and I hosting this podcast. Are you not trying to help people? No, I'm not trying to help people. I am in no way trying to help people. I would have this conversation by myself. So I'm just having it now with Andrew, and other people are listening in, but we're not going out of our way to shove it down anyone's throat. We're not going out of our way to convince people this is what you need to change your life. If we see somebody and they're going through some stuff, we're like, hey, you might find something useful in this podcast. Check it out. But at no point are we ever heavy-handed in the you need to be here vein. We never, ever imply that this is necessary, because it's not. But it's a conversation worth having. And so we're having it. But I wanted to address this because it's also kind of connected to how we choose our guests. This came up on Discord recently, that dualistic unity is an accepting environment for anybody to voice whatever it is they'd like to voice. And that's true in our groups. In our free groups or our Patreon groups, doesn't matter what your belief is, doesn't matter what your point of view is. If you want to come in and you want to talk to us, we are happy to do that in an environment where we can kind of stretch it out, where if you're not comfortable, you can exit. There's a number of reasons that it is a safe space for you to join in those conversations. Our podcast is different. And the reason I say that is because the podcast is a conversation with a certain topic, which is reality, what is, as opposed to identity and the illusion that validates us. And so when Andrew and I choose our guests, we do so very carefully. And what I mean by carefully is that we choose people that we feel would have more sensitivity to find a middle ground with us, more willingness to question themselves a little bit and find that middle ground during an episode, rather than a guest who's going to come on to the episode with a point that they need to prove. And the reason is because that kind of guest doesn't do well under questioning. And I know this through experience in life coaching, in dealing with other people throughout my entire life. I understand there is a mentality that is so invested in itself that even getting into the conversation that everything is questionable becomes a threat. And so, out of consideration, we do not invite those people onto the podcast. It's not because we're afraid to have them on the podcast or we're afraid that they will question us. We like questions. We encourage questions. But because we're always coming from the point of view that there is no answer, that the point is the conversation itself, we're aware that some people don't like that. and they're not going to deal well with being recorded in a setting that will later be made public as they get angry about having their belief questioned. And it doesn't do them or us any good. See, that's the thing. Like, there's a temptation there for the ego to want to prove them wrong or convert them or save them. But that's not what this is. There's no one to save, there's no one to convert. There's no point we're trying to get across other than reality is what it is. That's it. Uncertainty is the nature of reality. That in itself creates discomfort for the ego on any level. And so we're very careful about the people that we bring onto the show, just for the point of recognizing that it takes courage to find that middle ground. It doesn't take much courage to go out there and tout a concept as truth at all, but it does feel good to do so, especially if it's your concept.
Yeah, and as I was saying before, there's no prerequisites to anything. So, if you think there's a way that we should be inviting guests on, or certain guests we should be inviting on, fuck all of that noise too. There's, it's at the end of the day, this is our podcast, and any idea of what you think, should, this is the way to act though when you're free. This is what you do when no, none of that. There is no way to act when you're free. You're it. Everything you do is an expression of that freedom. So if you want to have someone on, cool. If you don't, cool. There's no right way. There's no should when it comes to that. And if we had someone on who was deeply entrenched in their belief system, as that's questioned, like, that's the nature of believing in something, is you're going to get uncomfortable when it's questioned. It's how it goes down. And so someone who has a company built off of, a certain type of message, or, say a priest is deeply rooted in that sort of thing, and that is the nature of their life. We start questioning that, like, how do you think that's going to go realistically? I mean, I haven't personally had direct conversations with priests about these types of things, but I know Ray has, and I've heard how they have gone, and they almost never end well. And I could hear someone pushing back and being like, well, maybe give them an opportunity to do so. It's like, that's not on us. That's not our responsibility. There's no one to free. There's no necessity to, get someone on to allow them the opportunity to question everything they rely upon to feel better. It's not on us. It's all me anyway. So, me being free is the extent of all I ever have to do. But anyone who pushes any sort of narrative, like, you need this, or this is beneficial, or anything like that, has something behind it that's going to distort the point. And so you won't hear us going around saying, oh, you should listen to Dualistic Unity. You need to check it out. It's something that'll definitely help you. And I can hear pushback to that being like, well, you guys post videos. Like, yeah, we share insights. We share things. There's no intention to fucking save the world or anything like that. Who's there to save besides myself? And the idea that there is a world to save, that there is other people to save, is distorting it. So if you're coming across someone with a grand old God complex or a Messiah complex, and they deep down believe that, I need to save other people, ask them how clear they really are, if they still think there's anyone else to save.
Absolutely. And I want to touch on this very quickly because it is important. I'm just here to fuck around and find out. Like, I've long since got over my urge to save the world or change things for the better, quote unquote. any of that. And it's only because that mentality is arrogant. It thinks it knows best, and it cuts itself off from the rest of reality and the intelligence that that reality embodies. We're trying to say that we know what's right for everyone, but we're still dividing ourselves from those people. And so it really isn't that we know what's right for everyone, because we can't even relate as everyone. We're still too busy thinking about ourselves. And again, it's important. The reason that Andrew and I don't try to sell dualistic unity to any large degree, like we never say the secret to mental health is in season 2. We never say stuff like that, because at the end of the day, I'm well aware of the fact that somebody could listen to all 4 seasons of dualistic unity and not get anything out of it, and yet still go around saying, I love dualistic unity. That is true. And they will say things that are completely contradictory to everything that we've said throughout 4 seasons in terms of reality not being a concept, in terms of recognizing you're not what you think, and that the realization that we're all one is almost unnecessary to the recognition of your freedom. It's so easy to get into this conversation and listen for the things that validate the belief structure that you want. You can get into any metaphysical conversation and listen for the things you're like, oh, that sounds like manifestation. Oh, that sounds like the law of attraction. Oh, that sounds like they're talking about chakras. And you can just keep looking for the conceptual stuff that you already know and validate that. The whole point of this podcast has been that none of those things are the reality they point to. And that's it. That is the realization that makes the miracle of self-awareness, of change here and now possible. That's what makes this possible, is the fact that it's right here, right now, all the time for everyone. And you might be committing a crime. You might be in porn. You might be wasting your life, quote unquote, sitting on the couch watching Netflix. And all of a sudden, in a moment, as though it were a miracle, you'll suddenly recognize that you're not what you think you are, and that all of the habits that you've formed around that illusion are hurting you. And you'll have the impulse to stop. You'll have the recognition you can stop, and it will change your path. Does that mean somebody has to go and do porn or commit a crime or sit on the couch and watch Netflix in order to have that recognition? Nope. It's always there. It's just waiting for us to have the willingness to look at it. But then when we do look at it, it's not like the habit of the ego goes away. It's not like all of a sudden we're like, oh my God, I'm not what I think I am. And the brain's not, no, you're this. And we immediately habitually fall back into that entire illusion because it feels good to think we know who we are, until we recognize that that good feeling comes with a price, that it's only good for a short period of time.
I think that's a really important point too, when it comes to, the deeper recognition of being everything, because people will point to that and be like, oh, you guys are saying you're everything. Well, some people aren't at that point, and they're, trying to get there or whatever. To be very clear, that recognition, no matter how clearly you see it, is not a cure at all. It is not a cure. And I think a lot of people get confused into thinking that there is a point where all of your insecurities, all of your fears, all of your problems just vanish because, you're enlightened and you're everything. And no, it's none of that. Maybe it's a, as you go deeper into it, there is more willingness to face the things that allow you to overcome certain fears. But the recognition itself, especially the fucking conceptual recognition, which is not really it. Because there's lots of people who are like, oh yeah, unity. Yeah, we're all one. Yeah, everything's connected. Yeah. And they don't see jack shit. They're so caught up in the idea of it that that it still has to do with them. I'm the one who's seeing that I'm everything. It's like, who's seeing that you're everything exactly? Who's seeing that everything's connected? Who's seeing that you're not what you think you are? Exactly. And so people get caught up in thinking like, oh, I get to that point where I recognize that it's all me and poof, everything goes away. No, it's not it. There's no cure. There's no cure all to everything that you're going through. There's no point on this made up path that you believe there to be in which everything just vanishes. You're it right now. You're at that point right now. You're at the end of the road right now. It's just your willingness to recognize that, your willingness to face the things, your willingness to deal with the shit, and understanding that you're not what you think you are doesn't immediately cure it, but it at least allows you some clarity to face those things, to deal with those things, thinking that you are what you think you are, meaning that you should be somewhere else, is only going to reinforce all of those things. It's going to keep you further from that. So it's a letting go of that idea that allows more space to deal with your shit, but it's not a point that cures all of your shit immediately. It's just a recognition that can allow you to take the shit that you go through a little bit more lightly along the way. But I just want to really get it across that there is no cure to anything that you're going through, and any depth of the recognition is not a cure, but things get lighter as you dig deeper into the recognition that you're here now and what comes of that. There is a depth that makes things easier, but it doesn't cure it. The recognition itself, the understanding itself, the conceptual idea of being everything is not a fucking cure. And I think it's very important to recognize that, because it can help drop your desire to get to that point, because it's not, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Just another recognition that you can have as God in each and every moment, as the reality of God, but not the idea that makes you feel a little bit better, because that just takes you further from actually recognizing it.
Well said. It's interesting because it's like we look around at the suffering in the world and the suffering that we've experienced, and we think we have to get rid of this. I can see that so much of it is optional. And so I have to help the world get rid of all of this suffering. And it's still about us. And so there's still more suffering that we're adding to it. And so it's almost like we have to sacrifice the weight that we're adding to our collective suffering so that we can help everybody else hold up a bit more of the collective weight as they can shed theirs. And that's not about saving them. It's about being of service. And I think that that's an excellent point to wrap up this community topics episode. It really is an important thing to think about in terms of thinking about yourself. It's really easy to feel really important when you have a lot of insight. The point of those insights is to make it so you can align with what is, not to control what is. You don't have to justify your need for control with good intentions. You can just recognize it's a need for control and let it go.
I don't know what's best. You don't know what's best. And in the dropping of the idea that we've ever known what's best for me, best for you, or best for society as a whole, you start having a different discussion about these things, as opposed to trying to get to a place in which we have everything figured out. We can just be that place of figuring it out and allowing that process to unfold. And the less you're involved in that process, the idea of you, the easier that gets. So anything that involves a lot of you, it only ever makes it harder, including the idea that you're some fucking savior for the rest of the world that is going to help cure everything and everyone, because you can't see that they're all you anyway.
An excellent community topics episode. We will see you next time. Thanks so much for joining us. We do look forward to having this conversation in Patreon. If you would like to explore it in greater detail, there is a lot to talk about. And it really does come down to self-honesty. And I know you have the courage for that. So take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone.